All right, welcome to the Elias Macko Show. Third hour of the program. We'll be with you until noon right here on CJAD 800. We begin this third hour by taking a look at homeless encampments across the country. You know, they're nothing new. We have seen examples of homeless encampments crop up in this city. And while no one wants to live through a Canadian winter in a tent, these encampments are growing. We're seeing more of them across the country. Let's find out a little bit more and find out if this is the new norm. Andrew Duffy is on the line, a writer for Postmedia, recently published a piece for the Ottawa Citizen looking at Tent City Nation, as it's called. Andrew, welcome to the program.
Oh, thanks for having me.
I took a great interest in your piece, Tent City Nation. Are Canada's homeless encampments here to stay? What's the answer to that question, Andrew?
Well, they're certainly here to stay in the short run. I mean, that's what everybody's been telling me. The problem is massive, you know, and there's a lot of things that have to happen in order to address what is a very complicated problem.
And how are cities handling that? What did you discover on that problem as you looked into it?
Well, I mean, that's the interesting thing. Like, there's really sort of two approaches. One is what they call a human rights approach, and that's what we've seen in places like Hamilton and London, where basically the cities are trying to provide essential services to people in homeless encampments. You know, provide them water and bathrooms and sometimes electricity, garbage removal, and basically help them survive in a Canadian winter. And then there's sort of a more aggressive approach. And you know, some cities like Edmonton, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, they've basically seen encampments, become so big that they consider them dangerous. You know, they're fire hazards and people are dying of cold. And so in places like that, they've really taken a more aggressive approach and tried to clear the camps when they get too big or too dangerous. And that's really what we've seen, you know, across Canada, those two basic approaches.
And can we tell which approach works better?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, we're still pretty young at this. You know, it's still pretty early in the game. So that work has not really been done. You know, there's a federal housing advocate, and you know, she recently published a report that called on cities to stop clearing encampments. That, you know, she suggests that you're really damaging the lives of people who are already vulnerable by clearing these camps. And so she's called for a moratorium on those clearances. But the cities have not agreed to that. I mean, they still want to be able to manage the problem when they believe it gets out of hand.
I was living, Andrew, downtown up until recently. I just moved out of downtown, and there was a park across the street. And at times, and you know, a couple of years ago, they let it get to a pretty to a situation where there was, you know, half dozen tents. In more recent years, when one would show up, it would take a couple of days, and they would have it cleared out immediately. But I know, you know, this is you mentioned it's turned into a human rights issue at times. We even have courts have chimed in on this one as to it being a human right. But then on the other aspect is the people that live in those neighborhoods, right? The people who live in front of that homeless encampment. Tell me about that aspect here and that battle that's happening.
Well, that's the thing. You know, there's really two clashing sets of rights. You know, one is for people's ability to enjoy their own property, their own neighborhoods. And, you know, the other is just a fundamental human right of the people who are suffering that homelessness, to survive. And so the courts have weighed in. In Kitchener, the city there tried to get an injunction that would allow them to clear the streets. And the court basically said, you know, you can't do it. You can't clear your streets unless you have some place for these people to go. You have to have room in your shelters in order to clear an encampment. And the courts in BC have basically said the same thing, that there's this right to shelter, that, you know, in a housing crisis, people have the right to live somewhere, even if it's on the street, even if it's in a tent. And so, you know, I think the courts will start to make policy to some extent on this. You know, if there's a case that goes to the Supreme Court, it'd be very interesting to see what happens.
How is life in these tent cities? What are the conditions, and what happens when you end up with dozens or hundreds of people living in one tent site?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, the biggest tent cities are really in the west. So Vancouver's had a really big tent city. Edmonton is a really big tent city, and and in Edmonton, it got to the point where government officials were saying these are dangerous. That not only is there a danger of fire, but drug dealers and gangs started to move in to try to prey on the people. And, it's there's no doubt it's dangerous to try to live through a Canadian winter in a tent because, the way they try to keep warm, they have, propane heaters and, tent stoves. And, there have been deaths across Canada at those kind of camps.
You mentioned before with Andrew Duffy, a writer for Postmedia, recently published a piece on the Ottawa Citizen website called Tent City Nation, looking at homelessness encampments. Andrew, you mentioned before that some cities have taken a tougher approach. Obviously, homeless people don't just disappear. So in the cities that took a tougher approach, what happened to those homeless populations? Did they go to other cities? Did the tough approach also coincide with more homeless housing projects? What happened there?
Yeah, so there's different things. Sometimes what's happened is that people simply move a couple of blocks away, and that's certainly happened in Toronto and Calgary, Vancouver, and that's what the advocates say is that, look, this is kind of pointless because if you tear down a camp, it's just going to pop up somewhere else in your city. And that certainly happened. So, in the biggest clearance in Edmonton, they've been very aggressive on this. They invested a lot of money to create emergency housing for people. And that's playing out now. So we'll sort of see whether or not that solution has worked, because sometimes people don't want to go into shelters because the conditions in shelters have become so bad. The overcrowding's been has really worsened in the last couple of years. And so some people just don't want to go to shelters anymore because they're terrible and they prefer the tents.
You spoke to a lot of people that live in these tent cities, these encampments. What were the common stories about how they ended up there, why they either like being there, and their lives right now?
Well, that's the thing. They have difficult lives, and obviously, there's everyone has a story about how they ended up there. And they're as varied as you can imagine. But there's no doubt their lives are difficult, and they're sort of paying the price for a lot of policy failures that have happened over the last 30 years, not the least of which is the fact that the federal government stopped investing in affordable housing for 30 years, and they've recently returned to that game. But we need something like 3.5 million homes in order to redress this imbalance in the country and the shortage in the country, and that's going to take a lot of time to build.
Andrew, we'll leave it there. I want to thank you so much for coming on the show this morning.
Thanks for having me.
That's Andrew Duffy, writer for Postmedia. You can read his piece on the Ottawa Citizen website. It's called Tent City Nation.